Hello, everybody, and welcome to this class series. And I think most of you know my name is Nayaswami Jaya. Thank you very much again for coming and attending. And I'm looking forward to this class series on the topic of balance, balanced life. I think this topic that we're going to be addressing this week and next is a very interesting one. And in fact, over the years, people have asked me for advice and questions about the spiritual path. And I think this is one of the topics or one of the questions that is most frequently asked. How do I stay balanced in life? How do I balance my duties, my job, my family, and also my spiritual quest? And this question of, you could say, taking the spiritual path or spiritual inspiration and applying it into daily life, it confronts us with any number of practical problems. And I think this is perhaps one of the central cores of the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, is how to take these exalted teachings, the teachings of Kriya Yoga, the traditions of the past, how do we apply them with energy and with fervor and with enthusiasm into our daily life, and also maintaining our sense of balance and ability to do the duties that we encounter in daily life. And he came with teachings that were very practical. And I think this is one of the hallmarks of Yogananda's teachings, is bringing a sense of well-roundedness into life. Many people have this thought about religion, perhaps, not so much maybe religion in the West, because it's been somewhat demoderated, you might say, or balance, you might say, not going too far one way or the other in one's religion. But particularly when one thinks of the religions of the East, there is a tendency sometimes to think, oh, you have to run off into the jungle or up into the mountains and lead what seemingly outwardly looks like a very unbalanced life. And one's impression of a true yogi is one who abandons everything and goes off and lives such a life. And that's not true at all. Now, there are people who do that. This is in the West. There were, in ancient times, people went off and lived in caves in the desert. So that's always, you might say, one extreme of the spectrum that's always there, and it has perhaps its place. But for you and I, people who are in this modern world that we live in, how do we live a life that balances all the aspects of our personality, emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally, all of these things? How do we bring them into balance? And I think this question of how to do that is what I will be addressing in these classes. Although this week, perhaps not. I'm going to start out just by talking about the concept of balance itself. And then I invite your questions, which I put in the chat box, or you can email them to Bharat, who is hosting this forum, and submit them. And every week I'll come and I'll answer some of those questions specifically. But if you look at the teachings of Master, balance was one of those topics that he focused upon in his teachings. There's much to say about it. And if you're just thinking, he talked about balancing East and West, how though we need to come into balance. Balance the energies, male and female. We need to, can't be too one-sided in this or one-sided in that. How to balance the mind and the heart, logic and intuition. There's many aspects of balance, and we can address many of those in these classes ahead. But let's start off by just talking about the concept of balance, just generally, and get us started, and how that fits into the spiritual life, and particularly this path that was introduced, and these teachings that were introduced by Paramhansa Yogananda. And then again, put your particular interest in the chat box, and we'll come back to it. And just like as we often do in these class series, I'll come back and I'll spend a little bit of time answering previous week's questions. And if we have time, I'll even open it up to questions live, and we can talk about that. Or maybe even at the end of the class series, we can cover any questions that might have come up during the series. Now, I want to start by the quote of the there's a quote from the Gita which we know, and if we can, this is Krishna saying to Arjuna, sixth chapter, "O Arjuna, yoga is not for him who eats too much or who fasts too much, who sleeps too much or sleeps too little. One who is temperate in eating, recreation, working, sleeping, and wakefulness attains yoga, which destroys all sufferings." And so you can see this is an ancient tradition and of the basic teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. And also, if you look at, from those times, thousands of years ago, also the teachings of Buddha. If we remember, we read the life of Buddha. He started out as a very severe ascetic, seeking God, or seeking, perhaps not God, so much he defined it, but seeking truth, seeking knowledge, seeking liberation from suffering. And he took up the path which was, accepted in those days of mortifying the body, fasting, not sleeping, doing rigorous practices. And he found, after practicing those for probably years, he found that it wasn't giving him what he was really seeking, what's that inner realization, and he abandoned that path and took up what he termed a path of moderation, and not too much one way, not too much the other way, the middle path, you might say. And of course, those other ascetics who he was in company with at that time, at first they shunned him. They thought he was fallen. He had fallen from his high goals and had, you might say, descended into what they dismissively thought of moderation. In other words, a very wishy-washy approach, not doing anything very seriously. But that wasn't the case at all. It was the middle path of not too much one way, not too much the other, because there are dangers in that aesthetic path. And you find that, and this is what Paramhansa Yogananda said, that sort of fanaticism, you might say, taking anything to too far in one direction, what happens is you end up substituting, you lose your priorities, and you begin to obsess in one direction or the other. And fanaticism, of course, is the opposite of what we're speaking about here. You have on the one side being well-balanced. And what's the opposite of that? Somebody who's a fanatic, obsessed, and they lose sight of the priorities. In fact, Paramhansa Yogananda counsel, he says, too much in one direction, too much of fanaticism, what it does is it threatens your devotion. You end up substituting for love for God, which must be full of energy and one-pointed, but you substitute outward expressions in these excessive practices, demands of willpower, and you begin to substitute willpower for devotion, and eventually you lose that devotion, and it can actually make you very unbalanced, and you won't find that which you're seeking. But of course, we need to then modify that, or think of it in terms of, well, we have to, moderation. And I remember that I've told this story before, that when I was serving in New England, it's part of northeast part of the United States, I was starting a meditation group and giving a lecture in one area, and the fellow said, "Oh, I'm very moderated. Absolutely, the middle path, that's my way." And I says, "Well, do you meditate?" "Absolutely, I meditate." "Well, what's your practice?" He says, "Well, after a hard day's work, I come home at night, I pour myself 2 ounces of whiskey, sit in my chair, put on soothing music, drink my whiskey, and I keep it all in balance." And of course, many people, it's their idea. To be balanced means not to be don't go overboard. Isn't that so? People say, "Oh, you're a vegetarian, are you? Oh my God, you're a fanatic." And of course, you find people in the other direction who, "I only eat fruit." Well, how about a little? No, I only eat fruit. And now, not to say that eating fruit's a bad thing, but usually for most people, it becomes a religion. And diet is a very good example of how people can take a well-meaning thing to an nth degree, and they end up becoming unbalanced. Their life becomes focused on something that is not necessarily taking them to their goal. That goal of God realization, that goal of love for God, of the opening of the heart, of inviting God into our lives, and they begin to substitute outer actions, outer behaviors, outer rituals, outer practices as a substitute for what we are really looking for. And this, of course, you could say applies to everybody to some degree, where you might say all of us a little bit out of balance. And, sometimes our logic, we go by logic too much and we begin to dry up the heart. Or perhaps we go by the heart and we become excessively emotional. And of course, there are other people which is very popular these days, approaches, well, I'm going to become a yogi, and they dive into hatha yoga practice and their body becomes fit. Make the body fit for self-realization is what what Paramhansa Yogananda said. And it's a good thing. We should do these sorts of things. But then it in itself becomes a religion. You could see, why do they always have these mirrors in these physical fitness places? So they kind of, looking at, and you become a little bit obsessed with that. And all of us, to some degree, I think it's good for us to have a certain bit of self-introspection, looking at our own lives and ask ourselves, in what way might we be out of balance a little bit? We go too much this way, and we go too much this way. And I think it is actually part of the process of growing to actually become a little unbalanced, because becoming a little unbalanced in one way, if we're truly introspective, we begin to see, nope, that's not it. And you could say it's part of the, Jnana Yoga tradition, not this, not that, neti. And you find yourself slowly discarding, well, I went too far there and I went too far this way. Isn't this so? I know in my life, I've seen, yes, okay, I've been very, you might say self-disciplined and doing, being a little rigorous with myself. And then, that didn't really work. And then you go the other way. And so on and so forth, which is probably a natural thing for us to do, is to take things to a point where you say, no, that's far enough. And then step back and find that middle ground of what actually works. And we have to, in the process of doing that, we have to make sure that we maintain our priorities. When we begin to lose our priorities, that's when we go off track. And of course, for us as yogis, as many of us here are followers of the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, we have to say, is it taking me in the direction that the Guru has recommended for us? Is it taking me into self-absorption? Or is it taking me in the direction of giving of one's heart, giving of serviceful activity, of forgetting one's egoic self? And this is a priority that we're aiming for in life, is to not become obsessed in any one direction. In other words, the path itself is to forget the path, to go beyond the path into absorption, into the goal and the goal of the path is what we're after. And so this process of not too much this way, not too much that way is essential. Now, Paramhansa Yogananda, as I mentioned or hinted at, discouraged any sort of overly done, fanatic behavior, and like the Buddha, like the Gita says, is to follow this path of moderation. But he said something very interesting, I find. He didn't dismiss fanaticism per se, because it does take a certain amount of one-pointedness. And you might say fanaticism, but he said fanaticism is only appropriate in how we think of it outwardly if one is highly advanced spiritually. So he didn't per se dismiss fanaticism. He just says we have to get to the point where we have some God contact within ourselves. Because once we have that God contact, you find many saints. You could look at them outwardly and they seem to be a little bit fanatical, but it was that one pointed devotion to God. You look at St. Francis, for example. Most people would say, well, he was fanatical. Or you look at the lives of many saints, that have gone off and in their search for God. St. Anthony living in the desert for 80 years. That seemed a bit, out of balance, you might say, to the normal person. And it would be, unless one had a certain, and you ask the question of why. Why was St. Francis the way he was? It's because he had Christ. He experienced Christ in his heart. And once one has had a taste of that sweetness, one wants sweetness. And so Master said, but he said, that's a very rare thing. And he says, but until we get to that point of having God contact, we're best served by moderating ourselves and fulfilling all of the duties that we have in life. We can't abandon duties unless we have first transcended that need to fulfill those duties. And our first duty is to maintain this body, maintain our equilibrium, maintain a sense of poise in our approach to life. And I think that's a good word to consider when we're speaking about balance, is to be poised. Isn't that, think of a ballet dancer, or think of a yogi, a good yogi. They stand poised, and that's a physical statement as our example that I've given. But what we are really looking for is that physical poise is a reflection of what we have within ourselves, an inner poise. And then that inner poise expresses itself outwardly. And that inner poise is an expression, or you might say is expressed through deep calmness, a steadiness, a persistence, and a unwaveringness in our behavior and in how we interact with the world around us, and an ability to keep things in proportion. I know, and you can see this in many ourselves and others, that sometimes we get out of proportion. And the world, when we're out of proportion, begins to give us feedback. And this is an important aspect for the yogi, is to look, how is my behavior, how is my actions being reflected back to me, and am I on a path that's leading to a successful outcome? I know recently here, and we had this pandemic, and I know people who are very anti-vaccination. And actually, I'm sort of a little bit that way myself. I wouldn't be vaccinated. The only reason I got vaccinated is because I needed to travel, air travel. But it wasn't a big deal for me one way or the other. But normally I would just let nature take its course. For me personally, not necessarily for everybody. But I knew people that were so obsessive about, not for themselves, but for everybody else. They began to preach in such a way that people began to say, wow, this person's really out there. And I thought, to my mind, people lost perspective. Now, one can have very strong beliefs, but when your beliefs begin to destroy your relationships with other people, you lose friends, you end up finding yourself isolated emotionally, and you said, maybe I've taken this a little bit too far, and have expressed it in the wrong way. And I remembered in that, I hope I'm not upsetting anybody with my views there, but I remember there's a quote that Winston Churchill said, "A fanatic is one who can't change his mind and won't change the subject." And I thought, yeah, that was unfortunately the case. And many people, they get a principle, and the principle may be absolutely perfectly fine, but they share it endlessly with others to the point where it begins to affect their lives, and it begins to affect, and they lost priority. We've come to this path to seek God. We've come to this path to be able to, live in a way that accommodates. Our behavior should accommodate that. And of course, if you find yourself losing friends, then you think maybe I ought to just zip it a little bit, and just keep in my own personal enthusiasms may not be other people's enthusiasm. So in this way, keep the body fit, but keep the mind fit, keep the emotions fit. And if you find yourself on a roller coaster, and that of emotions and opinions, there's something's a little bit out of balance, and dial it back, you might say, so that you can. What you choose for yourself doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be for everybody, because balance is not something that you can write on a whiteboard and say, to be balanced, do X, Y, Z, in thinking in terms of outer behavior. If everybody was to just do this, then they would be balanced. No, because everybody is unique, and what is balanced for one person is not necessarily going to be balanced for another. So if you think, oh, how do I do balance? How do I get balance? And then you begin to look at your life and say, oh, it's out of balance. If I could just do this, like balancing your karma. Well, I know I have karma. If I do enough here, it'll balance that particular karma there. But we've got millions and millions of samskars and things to balance. And if we approach life trying to outwardly balance our life, we find that it just doesn't work. And so what Paramhansa Yogananda, or what Swami Kriyananda advises, he says, these are things outwardly how you should trying to balance your karma so that everything's in equilibrium and adds up to zero, you might say, in the end. That's the guru's job. You leave it to the guru. And our job is to live our lives harmoniously, harmony, cooperatively, cooperation, in a manner of poised, and in a manner that brings us peace of mind, calmness, and deep devotion to God. And the outward expressions of that, we have to behave appropriately. Now, this is, what is appropriate behavior? Well, you have to conform to some degree to the realities in which we find ourselves in this life. And this is one of the things I admired about Swami Kriyananda. I met him when he was in his early 40s. He was a man of tremendous vigor, tremendous willpower, but he didn't express those things. He expressed his will. Yes, he did that. And he was somebody who could practice austerities if he so chose, but he chose not to. But he had that ability to do that. And once in a while, he would demonstrate. Didn't look like he was very strong, but he would sometimes demonstrate great strength. He would challenge people. Sometimes some of the men, you could say, he challenged them to wrestling, not wrestling like an Olympic sport, but being able to move, like wrestling, moving a person off a position. So who could stay still and move the other person and get them off balance, these sort of things. And he used to challenge some of the young guys, us young guys too, and he was very strong, and he could maintain deep silence. He could fast. He could do all of these outer things, but he never did those things particularly. And he counseled. He says, Master advised against extremes in that way. And there was one other monk in the ashram who once asked Master, and the subject was St. Francis. They were speaking about the life of St. Francis, and Master was speaking about how this practice of how outwardly sacrifice he could make for that. And one of the monks asked Master in terms of how austere St. Francis was in his devotional practices. And he asked Master, shouldn't we as a monastery be more austere and more like St. Francis? Is that a better way or a good way to go? And Master replied to him, he says, that which God gives you, you should take. But, actually, I'm going to find that quote. I want to get it right. But he says that which Master, oh darn it, I can't find it. But he said that which Master gives you, you should take. But don't be excessive, and you don't have to go beyond that. I'll find that quote and come back to it another time. But he was saying that was appropriate for St. Francis, but we live in a different age, and that's not the expression of spirituality through austerities where they can be helpful. Again, if a person has a certain spiritual advancement, not to lose their devotion in the practice, but it isn't necessarily for the common man. And for those of us who find themselves in a different age, living where the path of moderation, the path of neither too much left, neither too much right, is much more appropriate for everybody. And this is what he counseled. Now, again, per se, these other things are not necessarily bad, but we don't want to lose our priorities in life. We want to keep those straight. So the question would be then, how, balance is necessary also as a spiritual ed. What do we do to be balanced in day-to-day life? Well, I think one of the things, as I mentioned already, it begins with being able to be introspective, to see ourselves truly as we are. And one of the fruits of moderation should be even-mindedness and cheerfulness. So we must ask ourselves, am I even-minded? Even-mindedness comes from calmness. And truly, moderation, you might say, dampening down the ups and downs of life, moderation, but those ups and downs are really our likes and dislikes, being able to bring the likes and dislikes in our life into the state of, instead of extreme up, extreme down, moodiness, to be able to bring them into the normal day-to-day waves. And you find that it's like calming the ocean. We have to be able to attain a state of calmness. And will being out of balance in any way lead to a state of calmness? Probably not, because you're finding yourself, oh, I'm too much this way, I'm too much that way. And think about emotions particularly. If our emotions are not calm, we're not going to be balanced. If we tend to go to extremes mentally, even mentally, if you find yourself out of balance, you become a fanatic in this way or become a fanatic in that way. Can you moderate your opinions? Can you change your mind? In other words, can you especially, you could say a fanatic is somebody who's unable to change their mind even in the face of facts because they're wedded to a certain personal opinion. And so these sorts of things are something to keep in mind. You could say one of the other things is do you have the ability to see life in the long run, the ups and downs of life? We have to know that life is continually changing. Can you ride those waves or ride the winds of change to be able to accommodate yourselves? If you can, if you hold on, if you're attached to particular modes of living, if you're attached to modes of thinking, if you're attached to certain ideas, and you're not able to change those in the face of differing circumstances or differing facts that come to your attention, you begin to become fanatical and you begin to hang on to that, and you become unbalanced. Look at just physically. If the person doesn't exercise, they lose their muscle tone and they become physically unbalanced. They become, or like I mentioned a little bit earlier, a person become a food faddist. And it becomes food faddist. You end up making food, and what you're ingesting, that which goes into the mouth is as Christ would say, is not so important as that which comes out. In other words, your behavior, is it going to make you balanced in that way? So keeping these things in a state of harmony, in a state of poise. And practically speaking, we need to balance our activities in the sense of, if you work all the time and you serve all the time and you're that way, and you say, well, I've been taught to serve, but what about your meditation? Do you take time to meditate? Do you take time for recreation? Do you take time for seclusion? Do all of these ways we need to express that state of poise, that state of balance in our outer life. And are we doing that? And I think these are some of the things and how to learn how to do that. And you could say that in all of these, I think the key is not to confuse moderation for taking it easy. You see, it's not a matter of when we say be balanced, I shouldn't work so hard. The story that goes with that, when that one nun was complaining, Master kept telling this one nun, you work too hard. And she would say, okay. And then she stopped working so hard and sort of taking a little bit more easy approach to her duties in the ashram. And Master would just give her more duties and say, you need to do these. And she would do it, and she would try harder and harder. And then he would say, you work too hard. And this went back and forth over a period of time till finally she stops and she bursts out laughing and it says, Master, what if we were to change this word work to service? And then Master burst out laughing. He says, you finally understood. See, she was working too hard. But that doesn't mean we serve. And again, what's the difference there? What's the attitude that we bring to it? And so consequently, each of us is very unique in our own way. How do we balance these things? And I think, to be steady and persistent, but not lose sight of everything else that's going on around us. We have to have that balanced approach. And so some of these thoughts that I've expressed this morning or this evening, let's explore them in the application to our particular situation in mind. And I just gave this one about work versus service because it's, as I said in the beginning, this is one of the most common questions that comes up. How do I do my life energetically? Because we're taught we have to put full energy into it, put all of our will into something, doing something, even our spiritual life. We put a lot of energy into it, but yet not become unbalanced. Maintain a sense of poise, work versus service. My family, what about my family? I come on the spiritual life and I want God, but I have family duties. What am I going to do about that? Again, I think you might say, it's approaching life as either or. I've either have to do this, or I need to do that. And it's going to be one or the other. And this is a wrong approach to life. Life should be approached more from the position of both and. I'm going to do both this and that. And the key is doing them all with the right attitude and doing them all in keeping them all in perspective. But yes, that's easy to say. How do we actually do that? Well, let's explore that. And that's what we're going to do over the next few weeks. And so I welcome you to this discussion and encourage you to write your questions down in the chat box or give them to Bharat, who will forward them to me. And I want to next week start with this key one that's asked me so much: family versus spiritual life, or you might say work, my career and these things versus my spiritual life. How do I keep my spiritual life in proportion? And of course, I think we can intuit the answers is to bring that spirituality into everything we do. But the question of how to do that is going to be what we'll explore next week. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Joy to you.